Welcome to Foresight Friday at NIOSH. My name is Sarah Felkner, and I'm the Associate Director for Research Integration and Director of the Office of Research Integration at NIOSH. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of Foresight Friday at NIOSH of the new fiscal year 2022. NIOSH has recently established a strategic foresight unit within the Office of Research Integration, and we developed this webinar series to promote interest and capacity in the application of strategic foresight in occupational safety and health. Today's webinar is the first time we've made this series available to the public, and we're excited to share our work in strategic foresight with our extramural partners. Today, Dr. Jessica Streit will present a foundational paper on leveraging strategic foresight to advance worker safety, health, and well-being. Jessica is a health scientist at NIOSH and Deputy Director of the Office of Research Integration, where she provides leadership to key efforts in strategic foresight. Jessica has co-authored publications examining occupational safety and health risks and hazards, and has an interdisciplinary background in psychology, statistics, and health education. She also holds professional certificates in community and public health and strategic foresight. At the conclusion of Jessica's presentation, we will entertain questions via the chat box. And now it is my pleasure to invite Jessica to a virtual podium. Jessica?
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for your interest in the topic of strategic foresight and for joining us today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about strategic foresight and discuss the ways that we might add this practice to our occupational safety and health toolkit in support of protecting and promoting worker safety, health, and well-being. But before we get too far into the content, I will acknowledge up front that some of the concepts and approaches that we talk about today may feel a little different for occupational safety and health. But along those lines, we'll never know what we're missing if we only stay inside the comfort of the box we know, right? And after all, the factors that are affecting worker safety, health, and well-being in advanced industrialized countries like the United States have undergone a significant fundamental shift in recent decades. And it's become clear that we can no longer draw clear boundaries or boxes between work and the rest of life. Today, a large number of social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends, sometimes collectively called steep trends, are influencing work, the workplace, and the workforce in complex ways. We've seen, for example, that rapid market shifts and advances in technology have given way to a dramatic rise in part-time, temporary, contract, on-call, contingent, and gig work. And while these non-standard arrangements are sometimes praised for the flexibility and convenience they bring, they also tend to leave workers at greater risk by offering fewer protections and lower rates of pay. And while workplace automation has created new jobs and improved job safety in certain industries, it has also contributed to widespread work intensification, job displacement, and wage reductions. We also now have a highly diverse labor force due to changes in worker demographics and the environment and climate. And while these changes are desirable from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, finding effective ways to support workers ever diversifying wants, needs, lifestyles, and vulnerabilities has really become a significant challenge for occupational safety and health research and practice. And without a doubt, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has shown us just how quickly events like a public health crisis, which at first glance may not seem directly relevant to occupational safety and health, can accelerate change and transform entire industries almost overnight, resulting in compounding and sometimes immediate effects for worker safety, health, and well-being. But even before COVID threw worker health and safety for a major loop, the OSH community had already acknowledged our need for a transformation if we are going to keep pace with the rapid changes to work and that surrounding steep context. In 2019, colleagues from NIOSH and the University of Texas School of Public Health proposed an approach for expanding the focus of occupational safety and health in two important ways. The first way is what they called a horizontal expansion, which broadens the range of factors we consider that affect work and workers. This horizontal expansion recognizes that workers are affected not only by occupational risk factors, but also by personal, societal, and economic risk factors, which interact and influence one another while also impacting health-related outcomes. The second is a vertical expansion, which broadens the range of safety and health-related outcomes we consider to be relevant for occupational safety and health. This includes moving away from a mostly what's happening right now cross-sectional view of worker safety and health to one that considers the cumulative and compounding effects the workers face over time as they transition between jobs and maybe even go through periods of unemployment. This vertical expansion also requires us to take a more holistic view of the worker and consider the multifaceted construct of well-being as a work-related outcome. So from an occupational safety and health perspective, understanding and proactively managing this broad and ever-growing list of risk factors and outcomes requires us to expand not only the way that we think about occupational safety and health, but also the way that we approach it. And so because of that, we find ourselves with a need to expand our professional toolkits by adding in new and innovative and even systems-focused methods and approaches. And so today's presentation advocates for including a futures-oriented way of thinking and planning, excuse me, known as strategic foresight as one of those new toolkit options. So what exactly is strategic foresight? Well, it's a practice that's rooted in future studies. It's designed to help us better understand, prepare for, and influence the future. It recognizes that the future may not be predetermined or predictable, and instead it asks what may be coming, how that might affect us, and what we can do today to start building a preferred future. Strategic foresight really challenges us to start searching the present for what are called weak or early signals of potential change that could lead to one of many plausible futures. Identifying and monitoring these early future signals can reduce the likelihood that we feel unprepared for or surprised by emerging trends as they arrive in the mainstream. It can also uncover opportunities that we can use to leverage today's decisions and actions to start moving toward a more desirable future. It's important to clarify, though, that strategic foresight is a complement to and not a substitute for traditional strategic planning. Traditional strategic planning relies heavily on evidence from the past and asks how we might do things better, faster, or more proficiently in the future. And this backward-looking traditional approach can be very useful and efficient during times that are unchanging or periods of stability. But when conditions are volatile or uncertain or chaotic or feel ambiguous, as they tend to do when we think about the future of work, a more forward-facing perspective like strategic foresight can provide novel contributions to our planning and preparation efforts. Engaging in strategic foresight involves two distinct yet interrelated tasks. First, in strategic foresight, we map the future. We achieve this by developing descriptions of multiple alternative futures that are based on the systematic observation, organization, and synthesis of those weak and early signals of change that we can find in the present. These views of the future are not intended to be completely accurate predictions, but they are designed to be provocative and realistic visions of what the future could reasonably be based on those signals of change that we can see today. But creating the descriptions of what the future could be is not enough. And so because of this, the second task of foresight really involves assessing the implications and critical issues that are associated with those different views of the future. The results of that assessment of the critical issues and implications are then used to inform the design and implementation of feasible and responsive strategic options. Our options may focus on responding to very specific issues or implications from one potential future, maybe something that we really want to move toward or something that we really want to avoid. Or we can choose to design a more robust approach that helps us prepare for a number of plausible futures. In communities outside of occupational safety and health, many different foresight models and frameworks have been created as part of strategic planning efforts. This table lists about half a dozen formalized approaches that are frequently cited in the published literature. You can see they come from a variety of organizations from around the world, including academic universities in the United States, Europe, and Australia, the RAND Corporation, a major research organization that's headquartered here in the United States, the European Commission, which is a governmental office of the European Union, and Royal Dutch Shell, which is a multinational oil and gas company headquartered in the Netherlands. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. There are other options and approaches that are available. And there may be advocates for one approach to foresight over any of the others, but it's important to note that the approaches have not been directly compared to one another or systematically evaluated against one another. From what we've searched, there's no clear published evidence to suggest that any one particular foresight approach is superior to any of the others. Instead, a foresight approach is typically selected based on how well it fits the purpose of a foresight undertaking or project, including the needs and interests of key community members who may be affected by the results of the foresight work. And though they each provide a slightly different approach to foresight, all these popular models and frameworks include steps that do align with those two main activities of strategic foresight, that mapping the future, where we create the multiple visions of the future, and then influencing the future, where we take a deep dive into those futures that we've created and use what we learned to shape planning, decision-making, and actions. And all of these popular methods and approaches also share two other important features. First, they conceptualize time in terms of futures. So there's near future, mid future, and then a far term future. A method called three horizon foresight is typically used to define these futures, and it's often visually represented with a figure like the one shown here. So you can see we have to the left a y-axis labeled strategic fit with the external environment, which starts at 0 and increases infinitely in the positive direction. And then we have an x-axis labeled time, which again starts at 0 to represent the current day and then increases infinitely in the positive direction. And so we create plots against these two axes of fit and time to demonstrate how the conditions of a particular system or the way that we do things changes over time. First, we start with horizon 1. That's the near-term future or current way of doing things, represented by that blue decreasing S-curve in the figure right here. This current way of doing things starts off with a high degree of strategic fit in the external environment, but as time goes on, its level of strategic fit decreases. And intuitively, this should make sense because things are bound to change over time. And if we just keep doing what we currently do, at some point, that's no longer going to be appropriate or effective. And on the flip side of that, we have horizon 3. This is the far-term future represented by the increasing green S-curve. This represents a way of doing things that's not yet part of the mainstream system. Instead, pieces of this horizon are sort of on the fringe or in the margins in the current day. They start off in the present with a very low level of fit to the current conditions, but as time goes on and things change, we can follow this increasing S-curve to see that eventually this new system ends up overtaking that first horizon, and it has a high degree of strategic fit with the environment. It becomes the new way of doing things. And then in between these two horizons, we have horizon 2. This midterm future is represented by this orange bell curve shape and represents a time that's characterized by high levels of instability in a system as we transition out of horizon 1 and into horizon 3. We can think about these curves and how they apply to major changes related to work. So historically, work required an individual to get up in the morning, get ready, and take some form of transportation, be it private or public, into a single facility owned by a single employer where the worker carried out a specific set of tasks for that one employer. And occupational safety specialists were embedded within that single employer organization, and their focus was on keeping workers safe in that single physical work environment. And then occupational safety and health researchers would look for ways to gain entree to those workers to understand their hazards and exposures in that single workplace. That was the system. It was the way things were done. But as we talked about already in the beginning of this presentation, the factors that are affecting work have been changing. Advances in technology are changing what people do as work and who's available to work. And that tech combined with other factors like recently the global pandemic have shown us that not all workers need to report to a central facility to perform their jobs. And on top of that, the gig economy continues to grow and redefine employer-employee relationships. And so now we find ourselves in this period of great transition and turbulence amid these changes, and these really aren't showing any signs of stopping anytime soon. And so as a result, the traditional ways of thinking about and approaching work and occupational safety and health will continue to lose fit with that changing environment over time as new ways of doing things continue to emerge. We can see some early signals of this new version of the system now when it comes to things like the role of artificial intelligence in the workplace, the explosion that we saw of full-time remote work over the past 20 months, the continued development of gig arrangements across a variety of industries, and the development of new and innovative data collection methods using things like biosensors. Eventually, at least some of these new and emerging trends will become part of this new mainstream system. So in addition to conceptualizing time in those near, mid, and far-term future horizons, the popular models and frameworks of foresight also rely on scenarios as a primary tool for communicating about alternative futures. A scenario basically is a story with a carefully constructed plot line that describes one plausible future. And because the future is not predetermined or predictable, multiple scenarios are usually created for a single strategic foresight project. The exact number of scenarios will vary based on the purpose of the project, but most recommendations typically range from 2 to 6 scenarios per project. Any fewer and you won't have enough alternative futures to consider, and any more and you may have too many to meaningfully digest and analyze. The practice of using scenarios as a part of strategic planning has actually been around for quite some time. The 1950s are typically cited as the starting point for the use of scenarios as a planning tool. At that time, the Rand Corporation first began using scenario techniques to develop US military strategies. And at the same time, a research center in France began using scenarios to develop different political, social, and cultural futures for their country. In the 1960s, then additional groups began using scenarios as public policy planning tools. And soon after that, Royal Dutch Shell permanently adopted scenario planning as part of its business strategy. And Shell was able to capitalize on scenario-based foresight to create visions of the future that included oil scarcities and massive price increases, which helped them prepare for major oil crises in the 1970s and 80s. And so following then the success of Shell's scenario work, other large well-known organizations across many different industries also began to incorporate scenario planning into their business cultures. The success stories of Shell and other major industry adopters of scenario planning like Motorola, General Electric, and Daimler AG have demonstrated that the construction of useful scenarios is sort of equal parts science and art. It's really not something that we can approach without a plan. And so today, a number of techniques and methods are available to guide the scenario development process. Two of the most popular methods used to build scenarios for the future of work include the matrix method and what's called the archetypes method. In the matrix method, which is also sometimes referred to as a 2x2 double uncertainty method, that's one of the most widely used scenario building techniques overall. It really rose in popularity after Shell's scenario work, which was grounded in a similar method. As its name suggests, the matrix method consists of developing a matrix, which is typically a 2x2 matrix, by selecting two high impact, high uncertainty issues that will influence the future for a given topic of interest. The opposing poles, sort of the extremes for that issue, are identified, and then the two polarized issues become the perpendicular axes, as you see here, for that matrix, and that gives us this 4-quadrant grid for mapping scenarios. The archetypes method operates a little bit differently. With this method, alternative future scenarios are developed around common patterns of change for the future that are called archetypes. And while there's no hard and fast set of definitions for archetypes, one popular construction comes out of the laboratory of Dr. Jim Dater at the Hawaii Research Center on Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dater's years of extensive cross-cultural research on images of the future have produced a set of 4 archetypes that can be used as blueprints, if you will, for building alternative futures. First, there's a continuation or growth scenario that tells the story of a future where the trends of today accelerate into the future with no major changes or disruptions. And then there's a collapse scenario, or a future where the current system breaks or fails due to some negative force or forces or some type of dysfunction. There's also a new equilibrium scenario, which is sometimes also called constraint or discipline, where the current system is challenged in some way and must respond with a change that gives it a new sense of balance and stability. And then finally, there's a transformation scenario where the current system is essentially completely discarded for a new one in response to some fundamental change or series of changes. So we can look at examples from the published literature to see how scenarios of the future of work can take shape when these 2 methods are applied. In 2018, PricewaterhouseCoopers published a report that used the matrix method to build 4 plausible futures for the 2030 workforce. The axes of that 2x2 matrix were defined as individualism versus collectivism, and corporate integration or standardization, and business fragmentation, a situation where organizations are no longer operating sort of consistently. And this resulted in 4 plausible futures. The future ruled by corporate integration and individualism was called capitalism rules. And in this future, there's a widened wage gap and a strong focus on worker performance enhancement through things like augmentation, medications, and implants. And workers are also under constant monitoring. The future marked by individualism and business fragmentation was called innovation rules. In this future, high rates of tech use lead to decreased job opportunities and an increased work pace. And market pressures for companies to perform means that skills are really valued over the individual worker. Then there was a future defined by collectivism and business fragmentation called business ethics rule. In this future, there's a focus on fair distribution of wealth and resources and finding a sense of purpose and fulfillment through work that is both autonomous and flexible. And then finally, there's the future defined by collectivism and corporate integration called corporate social responsibility rules. And in this future, employers offer fair pay, family-friendly policies, and skills development. But the increased use of technology for ethical and environmental reasons has also inadvertently reduced the number of available jobs. Now, while each of these futures is interesting and maybe even thought-provoking or perhaps even a little entertaining, their real power as a tool lies in considering them as a set of potential alternatives for the future. In doing so, the 4 stories can work together to shed light on possible long-range future challenges for the workforce related to things like selection and recruitment, performance and personnel management, and learning and development. Shifting gears a little, we can look at the 2016 work from the Millennium Project team, who identified 15 major drivers of change and overlaid those onto Dater's archetypes to create 3 plausible futures for work and technology by 2050. This work produced a continuation scenario called continuation scenario called It's Complicated and Mixed Bag, where accelerated use of technology, high rates of employment and unemployment, and mixed success of universal basic income creates a future where large corporations have more power and control than the government. The collapse scenario is political and economic turmoil, and this is where unemployment in the 2030s has led to political turmoil, terrorism, and high rates of organized crime by the 2050s. And then there was a transformation scenario called If Humans Were Free, the Self-Actualized Economy. And in this scenario, governments have achieved a steady state economy by adequately preparing for the effects of artificial intelligence in the workplace, researching methods to phase in universal basic income, and promoting self-employment. And because people's basic needs are met, there's opportunity to focus on personal growth and bettering the self. And so again, while interesting and thought-provoking in their own ways, these scenarios are really designed to work together as a set that sparks strategic conversation and action. And actually, by analyzing these 3 scenarios as a collective, the Millennium Project team identified over 90 possible actions, each of which had a corresponding implementation guidance plan for creating an equitable humanitarian future economy. So these 2 projects from PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Millennium Project are just 2 examples of how scenarios can be used to spur additional dialogue about the current state of preparedness for potential future conditions, to shed light on key issues, and to yield specific and feasible recommendations for action. The community of organizations that's engaged in scenario-based strategic foresight like this to explore the implications of the future of work is growing worldwide. And this map shows the locations for the headquarters of the most active organizations in this space based on the published literature. This is a list of about 24 organizations that we culled from an in-house comprehensive search that we conducted at NIOSH earlier this year. And although these organizations are primarily headquartered in the North America and Europe, occupational safety and health related foresight initiatives and plans are starting to take hold in other areas of the world as well. In recent years, there have been announcements for things like the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University in South Africa and a Future Foresight initiative in the United Arab Emirates that was announced in 2020. And so although a number of scenarios have been published describing potential futures of work, including not only the PricewaterhouseCoopers and Millennium Project examples that we looked at earlier, but also many others, strategic foresight has really been arguably underutilized in occupational safety and health when compared to its uses for other business and decision-making efforts. It's possible that this may be due, at least in part, to a disconnect between occupational safety and health and foresight research and practice. Foresight research and practice is primarily found in future studies and technology studies, which have not historically been considered occupational safety and health relevant disciplines. And so because of this, the foresight experts tend to study and write about topics that are sort of outside of the areas of direct interest to occupational safety and health. And then that work also tends to be published in outlets where the occupational safety and health community isn't typically looking when seeking out new information. And so starting this year, NIOSH has really begun to focus on efforts to help bridge this historic gap between strategic foresight and occupational safety and health research and practice. Chief to this effort has really been the establishment of a dedicated strategic foresight unit in NIOSH earlier this year. NIOSH is also currently working on a foresight framework tailored for occupational safety and health. This occupational safety and health specific framework is an adaptation of the widely used and internationally recognized University of Houston's framework foresight. And we elected to build on the U of H framework foresight because it provides an approach that is versatile and flexible for foresight and can accommodate a variety of topics and projects with different aims, while also providing clear step-by-step sort of roadmap style instructions for working through the foresight process. And so the current version of the NIOSH Foresight Framework for Occupational Safety and Health is comprised of 6 stages. The first stage is framing, which involves identifying the domain, the central question, the client or end user of the foresight information, the geographic scope of what's to be evaluated and explored, and setting those time horizons. The next stage of scanning is really the heart of the foresight data collection. So in this stage, the user would review a variety of information sources to search for both strong and weak signals of potential change within the domain of interest that was identified during the framing stage. And then when you move into futuring, you get to really flex the creative muscles and develop alternative future scenario stories. Using the data gathered in scanning to keep you grounded in reality, you begin to conceptualize how the major drivers of change that we see today could unfold over time and result in a set of different stories for the future. And then envisioning, you assess those scenarios for their potential implications. there are potential risks, challenges, and opportunities that are associated with the stories are extracted from each of the scenarios. And designing then focuses on developing strategies that respond to the implications and issues that came from the scenarios. And ideally, these strategies are then shared with relevant parties who can take action and implement the recommendations. And because foresight is not meant to be a one and done activity, there's also then a final continuous stage of monitoring or scanning for new signals of change after a focused foresight project has concluded. And as those new signals are located, they can be used as inputs for future foresight efforts. And although these stages are presented in figure form as a step-by-step sort of function where you move from stage 1 to stage 2 and stage 3, the process is not entirely linear. So at the end of each stage, framework users are encouraged to reflect on the outcomes from all of the previous stages to determine if additional work or tweaks are needed before continuing to move through the framework. So the results of scanning activities, for example, may highlight the need for some additional refinement to the framing elements from stage 1 before we move on to futuring and creating those scenarios. Or after we get through designing and the strategic approaches have been communicated to the appropriate audiences, the scanning hits that are found during that monitoring may suggest the need to either start back at framing with a redefined domain because things have so sufficiently changed, or to re-enter the framework at futuring to update scenarios within the same domain that was identified in a previous foresight effort during framing. And NIOSH has recently been testing this framework with a project exploring the future of occupational safety and health as the priority domain of interest. We're currently engaged with international foresight experts to assess and refine the results of the project and to evaluate the overall utility of this foresight framework for occupational safety and health. And if you're interested in learning more about that project, you'll certainly want to stay tuned to the Foresight Friday at NIOSH series. A little more on that will be shared at the end of the hour today. So to kind of start winding us down and bringing this all home, strategic foresight can really be thought of as a tool that the occupational safety and health community can leverage to bring proactive futures-based thinking into our research and practice. The NIOSH Foresight Framework for Occupational Safety and Health, along with other available foresight models and frameworks, can serve as a blueprint that allows us to expand the range of realistic possibilities that we envision for the future of work, the workplace, and the workforce, which can help us to develop more comprehensive and forward-thinking plans and actions. And speaking of the future of work, existing initiatives and programs like the NIOSH Future of Work Initiative are well positioned as useful guides for identifying potential topics and domains or drivers of future change that are ready to be explored with strategic foresight. Similarly, other well-known occupational safety and health research resources like the Total Worker Health Programs, the extensive list of key issues relevant to advancing worker well-being, can serve a similar function and help us focus future strategic foresight efforts within a meaningful domain for occupational safety and health. To ensure that strategic foresight does not become a one and done activity in occupational safety and health, it will be important to invest resources into building foresight capacity within our community of research and practice. The Foresight Competency Model, which was developed by the Association of Professional Futurists, or APF, can serve as a guide for developing foresight knowledge, skills, and abilities within occupational safety and health. The 6 core competencies identified by the model are framing, scanning, futuring, visioning, designing, and adapting. And these should sound familiar to you at this point in the presentation because they really have a one-to-one alignment with the University of Houston's Framework Foresight and subsequently then the adapted NIOSH Foresight Framework for Occupational Safety and Health. As a starting point for building capacity in those 6 areas, we can look to APF's knowledge and skills development plans for both individuals and teams working in the area of foresight. And developing and sustaining formal and informal partnerships with experts from the strategic foresight community can also serve as a capacity building complement to that structured learning. We can look to others who have been successful in this area for guidance on how to begin. The Federal Foresight Community of Interest, or FFCOI, is an example of a forum where something like this has been done. FFCOI began in 2013 to bring together different US federal agencies, think tanks, and industry members to network, to learn, to analyze, develop, and share foresight best practices. And given its near decade of success in the foresight space, FFCOI is well positioned to provide occupational safety and health with insights on how to build and foster a sustainable, supportive community of foresight advocates and practitioners who have diverse subject matter interests. And so in conclusion for today, past applications of strategic foresight across a variety of industries show us that the future may be largely unpredictable, but it does not have to be a complete surprise when it arrives. Clues to what the future may hold for work and for occupational safety and health exist today as weak and early signals of change, and the practice of strategic foresight can really empower the occupational safety and health community to leverage those clues and gain realistic insights into the future, which can then help us establish responsive and proactive rather than reactive plans and options. And so applied to occupational safety and health, strategic foresight may help to inform the development of more forward-looking systems that are able to prevent injury, illness, death, and disability, and promote worker well-being across the working life continuum for generations of future workers. As Sarah mentioned at the beginning of today's session, this presentation is based on the NIOSH foundational paper discussing applications of strategic foresight in the occupational safety and health space, which was published in the International Journal for Environmental Research and Public Health just a few months ago in August 2021. Special thanks are certainly due to my NIOSH co-authors, Dr. Sarah Felkner, Ms. Nicole Edwards, and Dr. John Howard, for all their important contributions to our work in this topic. This paper is an open access publication available for free download without any subscription to the journal. And I encourage anyone who's interested in going a bit deeper on anything that we've covered so far today to download a copy if you haven't already. I've also pulled out the references from the paper that were used specifically to create the slides for this abridged presentation. In the event that anyone is interested in going straight to the original sources to learn more about foresight models, scenario building methods, future of work scenarios, or capacity building strategies for foresight. And so with that, I will thank you very much for your time and attention and turn the mic back to Sarah to get us started on the Q&A.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive primer on strategic foresight and an insightful look at how we can apply foresight in occupational safety and health. And now we're happy to entertain your questions for Jessica. Please enter them in the Q&A box. And if possible, please avoid the use of acronyms or abbreviations. Jessica, we have a few questions already. The first is, how do relevant events such as climate change and pandemics get incorporated into these models and frameworks?
That's a great question. And we can see in the NIOSH Future of Work initiative that those types of events are recognized as more sort of global level factors that influence the future. And different sources of information that are specific to those would be uncovered during the scanning phase of the project, where you're reviewing different sources of information. That can include having interviews with subject matter experts. And then as all that information is synthesized into potential drivers of change for the future, if those types of factors really are rising to the top as critical to the domain that's being investigated, then they would become part of those future stories.
Thank you. The next question is, how does the Foresight framework help us integrate health inequality research and program development? Or perhaps how can Foresight be used to integrate or consider health inequality research and program development?
Sure. So if diversity and equity and looking at health inequalities and inequities is critical to the topic of interest, then I think it becomes part of the frame for the project. And so it can really carry through from how the project is originally organized into the types of information that's sought out, and then can become a piece of the futures that are built as those stories for the potential different alternatives for the future. And then we can certainly keep a health equity lens in mind as we extract the implications and issues and start to build options and approaches in response to those for the different parties where we want to provide those recommendations.
So there are really two sort of discrete points in the Foresight framework model where you would look to be especially careful that you've considered health inequality issues, both in the scanning stage, right, when you're collecting your research and getting your inputs, and then in the implications phase to make sure that you've really considered those aspects. Is that right?
Yes, I definitely think it can play a role in both of those two sort of major buckets of activity that we talked about at the beginning. First is that mapping the future. So as the futures are created, and then also then sort of designing the future or helping us move toward a preferred future where we can use that health equity lens.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions about whether the webinar will be available for viewing after the event and how people can reach out to us. And the webinar will be, the recording of the webinar will be available. It will take a few weeks for us to get it through clearance, but it will be available on the CDC YouTube channel. And we can send out a notice to everyone who attended today once that recording is available. And if you'd like to reach out to us for more information, we'd be happy to talk to you. You can either reply to the original invitation you got for this webinar, or you could reach us at ori@cdc.gov. And we have several other questions for you, Jessica. What worker organizations, including labor unions, are involved in framing? And is NIOSH actively encouraging their involvement?
Yeah, so I think the real answer is there are no limits on who has a seat at the table during the framing of a project. Certainly having multiple voices, maybe during the framing or during the scanning component of a project, when subject matter expert interviews are a useful source of information, can really bring those perspectives into the futures that are created and then the implications and options that are derived from those futures.
And any additional comment on how NIOSH is actively encouraging their involvement? I assume labor unions.
Well, from a very fundamental perspective, we absolutely encourage all parties from the occupational safety and health community to consider the Foresight framework for occupational safety and health and how it may be a useful input for strategic planning and decision making, and to provide those different perspectives, because the more scenarios and implications, options and responses that we're able to share with the broader community, the more we're adding to the story.
Thank you. The next comment and question is, thanks for an excellent presentation, Jessica.
Thank you.
The questioner enjoyed your paper. You mentioned that this should not be a one and done activity.
Right.
What are the best practices for when and how often should we revisit our forecasts and guiding foresights?
That's a great question. And part of that has to do, I think, with some of the key issues or drivers of change that you're looking at for the future, what the topic is that you're investigating with Foresight, things that have sort of shorter lifespans, like technological advances happen pretty rapidly. So when you're thinking about near, mid, and far-term futures, you may want to only look out 5 years or 10 years. But if you're looking at something like culture change or something that sort of has slower moving wheels, you may be looking at longer time horizons. And so once a foresight, sort of a focused foresight effort has concluded, and then you're in that monitoring stage, the signals of change that you continue to see and record will really start to dictate when it's kind of time to refresh. An industry recommendation is sort of to revisit the focused foresight project, the full project from framing all the way through designing every 3 to 5 years or so, but that's not a hard and fast rule.
And in a corporate setting, it's often referred to as the length of the business cycle. So whatever a typical business cycle might be that relates to the domain of interest is also maybe another way of benchmarking that. Thank you, Jessica. A question about, can you expand a little more on how to influence the future with foresight information?
Sure. So the influencing the future is really where the product of the foresight, sort of the research, and then creating the scenarios comes into play, comes into strategic planning and decision making and action. And that's why creating the stories based on the signals that we see is not enough. That's not where foresight ends. It's then critical to really assess those scenarios that have been created and look for the implications they have for the future. Typically, there's a specific end user or client in mind for a foresight project. And so we think about things through the lens of that user. And what are the implications for that user and what they may experience or do in the future? And based on that, those implications and the issues that they could face, what are the recommendations for action today, or maybe even out a few years if we want to think about sort of looking at what the future may be and then sort of backcasting a roadmap to either get where we want to go or to avoid where we don't want to go. That's where foresight really has its influential power, is becoming an input to strategic planning, decision making, and action plans.
Great, thank you. There's been a request for the link to the journal article to be posted in the chat, and I believe it's there. So you can look for it there. You could also look for it on the website of the International Journal for Environmental Research and Public Health. The next question, Jessica, is there one takeaway you'd want us to take from this session?
Well, I think if I had to boil everything down to one sentence, it would be that it's never too early to be focused on the future. Having a futures-oriented mindset can be helpful starting today. And so whatever form that takes, thinking beyond the now and the near term and thinking about what could happen in the far term, and starting to think about how we move toward where we want to be and how we avoid the potential pitfalls is an important part of our planning and action.
Great, thank you. What do you think is the role that health and safety regulators play in occupational safety and health strategic foresight?
Well, I definitely think that from a subject matter expert interview perspective during information gathering, their voice is certainly relevant for strategic foresight or more oriented research projects. But foresight isn't only a research tool, it's also very much a practice tool. And so adopting the foresight approach and thinking about how that can be folded into planning efforts, regardless of whether it's for research, for practice, for policy and regulation, is very useful for the future of occupational safety and health.
Thank you. We have two related questions, so I think we can combine them. And it has to do with how the process of foresight ensures a wide range of perspectives. And in particular, making sure that workers are engaged in the process.
Yeah, so some of that, I think, voice comes in through the sources of information that are reviewed during the scanning phase. Again, workers can certainly be subject matter experts, depending on the frame for the project, what the domain of interest is and how it's being sort of developed for the project. But also the scanning hits, so for Foresight, really extend beyond where we might typically look for information. So scanning in Foresight is not limited only to peer-reviewed journal articles and formal reports. There's really a push to look at a variety of different information sources, and that can be things that are considered a little more, fringy, like blogs and magazine articles and things where the individual perspective can be shared. And so those can come in as data sources for the Foresight effort. And certainly there is, it's certainly appropriate, I guess I should say, to run the products of the Foresight effort by different interest groups and users who may be affected by the results of the Foresight work as the project is progressing. So just because, for example, if workers were not necessarily included with a voice in the framing stage, once we get through the scanning stage or the futuring phase, it's absolutely appropriate to take the scenarios or stories that have been built and to share them with representatives from affected worker populations to get their reactions to the stories. Nothing is sort of hard and final as you're working through the Foresight framework. Everything can be revised and adapted. It's all sort of living together through the life of the project.
Thank you. And one other additional comment I might make is that when you do your original framing, you define your domain of interest. And part of that process is also identifying the subtopics of your domain. And that really is one of the critical first steps in figuring out how broadly you're going to look, how inclusive. This is an opportunity to make sure workers are included, the labor perspective is included, corporations are included. So that first stage of framing is really a critical piece. It's also one of the stages that benefits from that feedback loop Jessica mentioned, where it's an iterative process. You start with your domain and topics of interest, and then you get into your scanning and you realize that you've learned more and you want to go back and sort of refine your domain map, we call it. And those subtopics are really a critical way to make sure that the diversity, inclusive nature of your search is present. Okay, next question is about how do you expect, get your crystal ball out and tell us how you expect AI to help us in strategic foresight, as in practice or already implemented, say 5 years in the future. What does your crystal ball say?
Right. So I was going to say, one of the major tenets of foresight is that the future is not predictable or fully knowable. And so I almost feel like I'm breaking foresight law if I try to extrapolate what the role of AI may be. But that's certainly an interesting topic that could even be explored with foresight, right? To look for what the signals of change are now for the role of AI in research and in practice, and to think about how that could be folded into future foresight efforts.
Thank you. Next question has to do with whether this type of work, foresight work, tends to be done in-house, or are there other ways organizations can access this kind of information for scenario planning within their own discipline?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, Foresight has some end user or client, if you will, in mind, and there are agencies, both within the United States and across the world, that specialize in foresight and foresight consultation. And so while the capacity can be built in-house, and we are advocating for the building of that capacity within occupational safety and health so that we can marry expertise in both areas, there are organizations that are available to assist with guiding different agencies through foresight efforts if they're new to the field.
Thank you. There's a question about a student who's working on their PhD that includes total worker health PhD that includes applying strategic foresight to work stress. And they're wondering how they might get in touch with the NIOSH Foresight unit. And I think the best way is to reach out to us at ori@cdc.gov. and we'll be happy to talk to you and connect you with other resources.
Yeah, and to hear about what you're learning about
exactly.
The future of work stress.
Exactly. Question about how do you control for bias in strategic foresight framework and methodology? It seems like you have to make a lot of assumptions and choices about what to highlight when creating scenarios and choosing what aspects to focus on.
Yes, absolutely true. And that's why foresight is designed not to create sort of correct predictions of the future, but to lay out stories of what the future could plausibly be based on what's happening today, what we see happening not only in the mainstream, but also sort of in those more fringy type of situations, right? Things where we see people trying new things or pilot testing things in different organizations, or we see small pockets of early adopters for different approaches to things. The point is to lay out multiple futures that could plausibly occur. The point is not to correctly predict what the future will be. And that's another reason why the continuous monitoring is important, because as those weak signals move into the mainstream, they move from weak to emerging signals, on their way to the mainstream, we can revise the work that we've done within the framework, whether it's going back to the framing stage or developing new scenarios to be responsive to what's happening in the world around us.
And I think it also speaks to the importance of having a diverse team who's doing the foresight work, so that you bring in as many different voices, specialties, experiences as you can, because where you search is in some part influenced by your own lens.
Mm-hmm. And those feedback loops can also be a nice checks and balances system along the way as well.
Great. So this next question is about how the foresight framework can be used to evaluate how the degree of unionization or immigration can influence workplace health and safety.
Well, I mean, I think that the answer there is to think about that topic as a potential domain for a foresight investigation. It may need to be more refined, maybe looking at that in topic in its entirety would be a little too broad, but it could certainly serve as the starting point for framing of a foresight effort, and then working through the stages to see what future scenarios for work might look like based on demographic shifts, and then what those implications are.
And I think it's also important to understand that foresight is not an evaluation tool. It's a tool that helps guide actions that can be taken to move toward a more desired future. So I do think it's important to distinguish foresight from evaluation. The next question is, the current pandemic was anticipated and prepared for, but politics, misinformation, and distrust overwhelmed much of the preparedness and solutions. Do you have a comment about that?
I mean, only to say that from what we've heard, yes, there are other experts within foresight who said that the pandemic was not a complete surprise, and to that effort, I think bringing this practice more into the mainstream so that more people are using this to have this forward-looking perspective might help us avoid some of the reactionary approaches that ended up being implemented during and still are implemented during the current pandemic.
And I think it also speaks to the relevance of this kind of a tool and approach to planning as well. We are at the 12 o'clock hour, and we can continue to answer questions. There are a few more so that we can get them on the full recording. And if you want to bear with us, we will get pushed through to the last set of questions. One is, how is NIOSH promoting foresight into research funding opportunities? and let me take that if I
Sure.
may, Jessica.
Sure.
We are early in our work in the foresight space, and certainly as we identify methods and approaches to identifying priorities, foresight can help us link our actions to priorities. And I think that would be a natural link that we would make to the, and I assume you're talking about external funding research opportunities. But we see foresight as being a very useful tool in the planning stage of helping us identify priorities. As I said, it's still a nascent effort within our wheelhouse at NIOSH, and so it's not quite ready for extramural research funding, but we support and encourage anyone who would like to use foresight as part of a planning tool. It would certainly be in line with an innovative approach to requests for funding. Next question is, how do you convince decision makers to use strategic foresight as a tool for tackling future issues?
Yeah, so I think that part of that is really stressing the idea that we're not bringing foresight to the table as a replacement for strategic planning efforts and approaches that they may be more familiar with, that this is another stream of input, that this is an addition to or a new piece of information that we can put on the table during the strategic planning process and decision-making processes to help inform actions and plans.
Thank you, Jessica. There's a question about whether you know whether there are any organizations that are using AI for strategic forecasting.
I don't know for certain, but there are some available platforms. Like there's a digital futures platform that we've heard the Office of Personnel Management in the US government, who also uses strategic foresight, mentioned before. And I'm not sure whether AI is rolled into the work that they do or if they've considered it, but it's not something that we're necessarily building into our foresight efforts just yet, although that doesn't mean that others are not.
Okay, next question is, can you provide some examples of strategic foresight being used specifically to support positive enhancements of safety culture in organizations, actions that employers can take?
Yeah, so this is where there's actually sort of a void in the published literature that brought us to the point where we felt that it was important to tailor a framework foresight for occupational safety and health. The use of foresight traditionally in business environments, for example, doesn't necessarily lead to the publication of those results. And so the sort of the published evidence is very limited, which is why we would like to bring a tailored framework for occupational safety and health to start implementing foresight in ways that we can understand and communicate back to the occupational safety and health community.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to have to close this out.
Sure.
The last one is NIOSH disseminating the results of their future modeling and methods other than professional journals, such as to employers and other occupational medicine communities? One way, and I might, while you're thinking about that, Jessica, one way is certainly in January, we're going to be presenting the results of our own in-house project on foresight. Jessica, do you have other thoughts about that?
Just that we're also focused on creating tools that can be shared with the occupational safety and health community. So beyond sort of our peer-reviewed publications, we want to make things that are accessible and useful to the occupational safety and health community. So developing a toolkit that helps different organizations walk through the foresight process for occupational safety and health is certainly a priority for the Strategic Foresight Unit.
Great, thank you. There was a question about you showed the 6-step process template that we adapted from the University of Houston. Are there other templates available? And if so, how similar they are? And I would refer you to the paper where Jessica does a wonderful job of describing many different approaches. And I think one thing that we found is there is a common soul, if you will, to foresight models that relate to each other and also support the notion that foresight can be useful.
Yes, they all sort of have their own spin, but they certainly include steps or stages or activities that relate to that concept of mapping the future and then also sort of implementing or influencing the future.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to everyone who attended. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of the questions, but we do want to thank you for attending and also mention that we appreciate your feedback by completing a brief evaluation. The link to the evaluation is available now in the chat box, and you'll also receive a post-webinar email from us with evaluation information. If you have any questions about today's webinar or would like more information about the Strategic Foresight Unit at NIOSH, please contact us at ori@cdc.gov. And we hope you'll join our next Foresight Friday at NIOSH on January 7, 2022, when we will present 4 futures for occupational safety and health, the results of a recent strategic foresight project at NIOSH. We look forward to seeing you then. We will leave the webinar open for a few more minutes if you'd like to access the evaluation link. We hope you have a great rest of your day